Less than 2.5 hours ago, I gave my last final for the term at Cal Poly, and so I'm extremely excited, which means that this presentation might be more of an interpretive dance than a presentation, because that means summer has begun for me. All I got to do is finish grading. Nice thing about me and grading is the fact that I can look at it, flip a coin, and say A or F, so makes it really easy. So the students better hope that heads comes up a lot. So today we get to talk about wheat production, which I guess is listed in there is it field production, something like that. But yeah, what we get to do is spend a little bit of time talking about wheat in Afghanistan. So let's just jump right in and see what we can do, and let's at the same time try and mess up the video guy. I'm moving around a lot. So here's the basic general outline of what we're going to talk about. We're going to go through some real basics of field crop production. We're going to look at key issues affecting improved productivity of the crop. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit about what are some of the low input on-farm or nearby resources that can improve productivity. And then tomorrow, we'll spend about 25 minutes together kind of talking about things. And I'll give you a couple of in-field, hands-on demonstrations of some of the things that we're going to talk about today. All right? So here's the objectives. I don't spend a lot of time talking about objectives because as I see it, they're in your book. So why waste time talking about it? And so my theory is instead of looking at a bunch of words on a slide, let's look at a pretty picture. So let's talk a little bit about wheat. Now, some of this we're probably going to fly through in the beginning because I think you all understand the value that wheat has in terms of the people of Afghanistan. But just to kind of give you a basic starting point that we're all kind of work from is the fact that remember that wheat is an important grain crop. Its total planting area is about 2.6 million hectares. This was an estimate in 2012 by the USDA. It accounts for 4.5 metric tons, or 79% of all cereals produced in 2010. So you're talking about a main source of food. 60% of the total caloric intake comes from wheat. And so if you want to break it down, per capita, the consumption rate is about 162 kilograms per year. Yes?
79% of all cereals produced in
Afghanistan.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So in terms of its total value, it's really important. So a couple background pieces of information for you to realize is that wheat is planted both as a fall planted and as a spring planted. Fall planted counts for about 90% of the total acreage. Spring planted is about 10%. Just to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about, fall planted is what we would say in the United States is winter wheat. In winter wheat, what we're talking about is we're going to plant it in the fall. Here we're talking about September, October, November. It's going to grow up until the winter. It'll go dormant in the winter, go through the winter, and come the spring, it'll start to grow again. The wheat will eventually be harvested then in either June, July, August, sometime around there, okay? So 90% of the wheat is going to be fall planted or winter wheat. The rest is going to be 10% is spring planted, okay? Now, one thing that I want you to take away from all this is to realize that fall planted is actually probably going to produce a little bit greater than spring planted. So if you could, you would actually prefer to do a fall planting than a spring planting. However, not all of environments are going to be great for fall planting. If the winter conditions are too harsh, for instance, you wouldn't be able to plant a fall planted. Okay, you would plant a spring. In terms of the production practices, about 45% of all the wheat is irrigated, 55% is dry land. What I mean by that is, 45% get supplemental water, 55% is rain-fed only. So here we're not talking about having any kind of irrigation system at all. We are going to rely on whatever the natural rainfall is within the area. And that could greatly affect your total yield. One last bit of information that I think is important for you to know is that in terms of the value of wheat in Afghanistan has two main purposes. Number one is for grain. Here you're talking about, producing a grain that you can make a flour out of to make a bread and to eat. Understand, however, that wheat also has a secondary function, and that is going to be for the straw. So the plant part of the plant can also be used. Most of that straw is probably going to be used mostly as a fuel source. But that is going to create a problem. In the U.S., when we harvest wheat, most of the straw goes back into the soil. And the nice thing about that is that straw contains nutrients that when we work it back into the soil, we add nutrients back in. If, however, I take everything out, the grain and the straw, I am basically removing everything that was in the soil before. And so if I don't add anything back, and all I do is take, eventually my productivity will go down. And so we need to talk about that because that becomes a really big factor. All right? Okay. So the way that we're going to do this is in the first 10, 15 minutes or so, we'll go through and look at challenges. And the challenges that we're going to look at are going to be global in terms of they're going to think big in terms of what are the challenges and how can we address it. After the first 10 or 15 minutes, we'll kind of narrow in on actual production practices. And when we do that, I will give you some examples of things that we can show on farm that might be able to improve productivity. Most of these initial challenges we're going to go through are going to require other things, but they're all going to be linked together in a certain sort of way. Okay? And as I see it, if I think about the production of wheat in Afghanistan, I realize that there really are kind of three factors that I think we can address. And it's based on a study that was done several years ago that looked at the challenges of wheat production. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is if you look at this really closely, they actually said there's 5 main challenges that are listed up here. And let's talk about them for a second. Let me walk on this side. All right. So this was a study that basically looked at what were the challenges to wheat production. And they looked at a whole bunch of different little pieces. It ranged from lack of credit down to lack of water. And they rated each one of these based on what the severity of the challenge was. Was it a big one or was it a slight or small or none? Okay? And so they went through, and if you look at it, probably the biggest challenge that they had for wheat production was lack of credit. It was definitely the most severe, but I call that financial services. And really, if you kind of think about financial services, this is not something that we're going to be able to address in a short amount of time. This is a bigger issue and way bigger than what I can do. I'm just an agronomist. I know how to grow plants. That's about what I do. So financial services, we're not even going to talk about. The other one that they mentioned was water. Lack of water is pretty darn important. But again, there's not much that we're going to be able to do in a short term. On one hand, you could say, well, I guess we can do a rain dance and hope that it rains. That increases the total amount of water. And then we could build reservoirs, or we can build an infrastructure to allow for delivery of water. Well, yeah, we could do that too. But again, that's a long-term problem. That's not something that we can address in just 1 year. Instead, I think what we need to do is focus on the 3 that I think we can do something about. That's seeds, soil fertility, and wheat pests. And if you look at them, each one of these has a relatively, slight to moderate kind of factor. And so what I would like to do is kind of go through each one of these for a second and kind of look at it from a big picture. And then when we get into the rest of it, we'll kind of focus in and say, what are some of the things that we can do to improve those in a short term on farm by doing small tweaks? All right? Now, one thing that I've had people ask is, if you look up here, you don't see anything that says wheat pests in this. But basically what I did is I looked at these right here. Rats, weeds, insects, and diseases. All of these together are wheat pests. All right, so we're going to deal with them as a global kind of problem. All right. So let's talk about quality seeds first. So, one of the problems that we have is the fact that the wheat that is being grown in Afghanistan has probably been grown in Afghanistan for centuries. In fact, you could almost say that it may have been in existence for possibly even, decades, hundreds of years, whatever. It could be there for a long time. And the reason why is because one of the things we're going to talk about is most of the wheat that is going to be produced is basically passed from generation to generation. So that means if I grow wheat, when I harvest it, I'm going to take some of that wheat seed that I harvest and I'm going to hold it. And next year, when it comes time for me to plant wheat, I'm going to use that same package, that same seed that I collected and plant it back. And year after year, I'm going to do this. So what happens is that, it's very possible that my grandfather grew a wheat variety that he passed on to my father, and then when I took over, he passed it on to me. And so the variety that we're growing has been around for a long time. Well, as time goes on, we've figured out how to make things better. We've improved the quality of the plants that we produce so that one seed produces more, or grows better, grows stronger. But that requires time and effort. And so at some point in time, within Afghanistan, you are going to need to infuse new materials into Afghanistan. However, one thing that you cannot do is you cannot bring in materials that are not designed to grow there. The worst thing that we can do is to walk out into one of the fields around here, grab some wheat seed, take it with us to Afghanistan and grow it. Because the reality is the way that we grow wheat here in the United States is very different than the way they grow wheat there. Wheat that produces really well here is probably not going to grow well in Afghanistan. So if we are going to bring in new materials, those new materials are going to need to be designed in Afghanistan. And so what we need to do, if we're going to improve high quality seeds, is that somehow or another we're going to have to bring in and produce and develop new seed materials. Well, in Afghanistan right now, the ability to do that is somewhat limited. So maybe in the short term, what we need to do is create ties with universities in neighboring countries like Pakistan, like India, where this kind of development is already occurring, and share material with them. Maybe then we can improve the quality of the plants that are being produced. Short term. Long term, at some point, Afghanistan's going to have to start creating their own. But again, that's going to take some time. Next problem. Once you improve the plant itself, you have to make sure that you plant good seed. Later on, we're going to spend a lot of time, and I'm going to tell you that the fact that if I give you a seed and that seed does not grow, how much does it produce? None. Zero. Zilch. Nada. You have to make sure that the plant or the seed that you plant is actually quality. What does it mean to be quality? Well, alive is number one. The ability to grow is number two. The ability to produce seed is number three. How do we actually do that? Well, one of the things that we need to do is we need to make sure that the seed that we plant is actually quality seed. In the United States, there are laws that regulate how we sell seed. If you go to a local hardware store and you buy a package of seed, on the back side of that seed, if you look, it will tell you what the percent germination is. It means that if you take 100 seeds and percent germination is 95, it means if you take 100 seeds, plant them out in ideal conditions, 95 of them will germinate, 5 of them will not. That means that every time I buy a package of seed, I know exactly what's in it. In Afghanistan, we don't have that guarantee. If you go to the local bazaar and buy seed, there is absolutely no guarantee that that seed is alive and will grow. At some point, you need to have some kind of guarantee that that seed will actually grow. In the U.S., we have seed labs that do it. They test all of the seed. They make sure that it is alive and can grow. At some point in time, we're going to have to introduce that to Afghanistan. Now, most likely, there are probably seed labs already there that are set up to do seed testing. And if that is the case, we need to start utilizing those. And later on, we'll talk about what are simple things that we can do to address this issue without a standardized system or a centralized system. Last but not least, you need to be able to establish some kind of local seed industry. One of the reasons for this, I think, is because a little bit of competition goes a long way. Because if you have one guy who's selling seed, you come and you buy seed and he sells it to you. You go and you take that seed and you plant it. And of the 100 seeds he gave you, 20 of them grow. You're going to be pretty mad, right? You're going to go, hey, wait a second, I paid you all this money and this is what I get? Well, if there's two guys selling seed, the next year, what are you going to do? You're going to go to the other guy and hope that he sells you seed that's of higher quality. A little bit of competition would say then that that first guy would go, hey, you know what? I need to increase my quality a little bit. The other nice thing about the seed industry is it's going to allow for the everyday farmer to be able to get materials that he needs in good quality and maybe even get a little bit of help. Now, I know in some places there are a small seed industry. I know Naveed has told me that before, that some of the areas do have kind of a growing seed industry. I can't remember what the name of the group was. What is it?
Nur Brothers, Nur Arabi.
Okay. So there are some. So it's coming. It's coming. And I think that would be a great thing, but that's going to take some time. Okay. Any questions on this? All right. Let's talk about soil fertility. Soil fertility is really important. If the quality of your soil is poor, the quality of your production is going to be low. That's pretty basic. All right? And so somehow or another, we have to know what our soil quality is. When my students go and plant on the campus farm, the first thing that they do is do a soils test, so that they know exactly what the soil has and what it's missing. Because if I know what it's missing, I know what I need to add. Right? So they go out, they take their soils, they give an analysis, and then we come up with a plan. Well, on this date or around this time, we need to add this. Or this or this. We need to watch this. We have an idea of what it is that we need to do to improve our productivity. To just look at a soil doesn't tell you what its quality is. There's certain things you can figure out if you know what you're looking for. But you need more information than that. Again, when we do it, we send everything off to a soils lab, and they give us all of this information. I keep saying that one of these days I'm going to bring in a soils test. I should. It's like 2 or 3 pages. Has every single piece of information you can imagine. Unfortunately, it only helps those that understand what's on it. If you give it to most people, they'd kind of look at it, it just looks like a bunch of numbers and letters. So just to have a soils lab is only one part of the problem, or one part of the solution. You also need to have somebody there that understands how to read that data. Most likely, in Afghanistan, they probably have all the machinery they need to do a soils analysis. What they probably don't have are people that can explain what that soil analysis means and how you use it. At some point in time, you're going to have to reintroduce that into country. Even above and beyond the issues of soils and soil testing, one of the things that I think we need to focus on in Afghanistan is going to be the improvement of soil fertility. I told you a second ago that, when we grow wheat, the two things we're going to do is we're going to take off grain and we're going to take off straw. Every time I remove those things, I am taking them out of the soil, and if I do not replace them, they are gone forever. What can I do to add material back in? That's what this whole idea of improvement of soil fertility is. In the U.S., one of the things that we do is we rotate. Very rarely will you find the same crop grown on the same piece of ground year after year. We rotate it. It might be tomatoes this year, next year it's cotton, and the year after that it's corn. In Afghanistan, this year it might be wheat, next year it might be wheat. Every once in a while maybe they'll throw in rice, or they'll throw in corn, and here's the sad part is that's not a rotation. Wheat, rice, and corn are all the same. The materials that they take out of the soil are basically the same. So at some point in time, I am going to have to improve my soil fertility, and the best way to do it is rotation. The other thing we can do is the utilization of cover crops. So mix something back in. You guys probably talked about alfalfa this morning or yesterday, maybe clover. Those kinds of crops are wonderful, and we'll talk about why. But if we can put those into production, we can really improve the soil. Last but not least, let's talk about plant pests. I love talking about plant pests because it's one of those things that whenever anybody sees a plant pest, the first thing that they do is say, what can I spray? My neighbors do it all the time. They're like, hey, you know what? You know a lot about ag. My lawn's having a problem. What can I spray? And my next question is usually, what exactly is the problem? And usually the description is something like, it's brown. Hey, great. That doesn't help me. One of the problems with plant pests is that if you're actually going to deal with the pest, you got to know what the pest is first. A lot of the time, if you look at a plant, the symptoms that you see can be caused by a multitude of different problems. It could be a disease. It could be an insect. It could be lack of water. It can be too high of sunlight. It can be the fact that your dog likes to pee in that spot every time. It could be just about anything. And so unless you know exactly what the problem is, you don't know how to address it. And unfortunately, one of the things that we're going to have a problem with in Afghanistan is the fact that we don't have the ability all the time to diagnose the problem. At some point, we're going to have to be able to diagnose it. If you're going to address it, you need to diagnose it. All right. The other problem, though, is once you have it diagnosed, do you have the proper tools to overcome it? If we don't have good financial services in Afghanistan, the ability for a subsistence farmer to go out and buy a chemical to deal with the problem is going to be very, very small. And so maybe the use of pesticides is not the answer. Instead, one of the things that we're going to say, and one of the things that I will show you, I hope, is the fact that crop rotation and pest management practices will overcome most pest problems. And so if you do this, in some cases, you don't have to worry about that. And so probably the best solution to the pest problem is to grow the crop effectively. And so one of the things that we get to do now is talk about how do you grow a crop effectively. All right? All right. So, like I said, really quick introduction. Any questions on this? Like I said, these are the global problems. Let's focus in. Let's look at it. Let's see what we can do. Now, here's what I did. When I was asked to do this presentation a while ago, I started thinking about what was the best way to do it. And one of the things that I came up with was the fact that no matter how we twist it or turn it, I am here and you are there. And with that, it means that I don't have the ability to see what you see. And so one of the things that I came up with was the fact that probably what I needed to do was more than anything else, was not tell you, oh, well, if you see this, do this. Or if you see this, do that. Instead, what I realized I needed to do is I needed to give you a little bit of background so that you might be able to come up with a solution to fix the problem yourself. Now, within that, I'm going to give you some pointers, some examples, some things to think about. But one thing that I've noticed over the time of training in this course is the fact that you guys come up with some of the best ideas to some of these problems. Because once you understand what it is that you want to do and what some of the problems are, you come up with your own solutions. And so, one of the things that I worked off of was the fact that innovation comes from understanding the process and recognizing a need for change. Here's how I describe it. It's kind of like the first guy who showed up to cut down a redwood tree. Now, I always ask, has everybody seen a redwood tree? To understand a redwood tree, realize that a redwood tree can grow large enough that while still alive, you could hollow it out and drive a small car through it. So we're talking about a large tree. Well, I guarantee you the first guy that showed up to cut down a redwood tree and showed up with a 3-foot saw realized there's a better way. Right? The other example that I use is the guy who decided that he wanted to add a room onto his house. Took his Jetta down to the local Home Depot, picked up all the wood that he needed to put that addition onto his house, and told the guy, go ahead, load it on the Jetta, she'll do it. You can see the end result. This is the funny part about this picture, is if you look really closely, I want you to notice something. The engine is running, which means at some point in time, this idiot decided that after all of this weight was in that back wheel, they could actually drive it down the road. And they actually made it a little ways. I think it was something like a quarter of a mile before the rear axle gave out. That's a true story. Yeah, I did a little digging. I found out it was a group of fraternity brothers that were getting ready for a party. I will tell you, they were not Cal Poly students. But the point was that if you understand where it is that you want to go, you start to pick out those things that don't make any sense. And that's what I hope to show you now. Kind of give you a little bit of background, give you something to work from. And from there, we can kind of build up. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of walk through the wheat production calendar. And so just to kind of give you a general overview, depending on where you are in Afghanistan, your fall planting occurs somewhere between September and the 1st of December. Okay, so this is autumn planting, winter wheat. If, however, you're going to do spring planting is going to occur sometime between maybe the end of February all the way up to maybe the 1st of May. So that's going to be your spring planting. Your wheat is going to grow until harvest. Harvest is going to go sometime between June and September. One thing that I want you to notice here is the fact that even in spring planted wheat, your harvest is still at the same time. So one of the reasons why fall planting is so much better is because, well, it gets a little bit more time for growth. When we plant fall planted wheat or winter wheat, I'll plant it usually in October. I'll grow the plant up until it's about yay tall. December will come, temperatures will drop, the plant will go dormant. As soon as it goes dormant, it just kind of sits. It can handle relatively cold temperatures, and it'll sit all winter long. As soon as the temperature starts to warm up in the spring, the plant will initiate growth again. The nice thing about it in the spring, when it initiates growth, it's already this tall. Yes, sir?
When you say relatively cold temperatures, I mean, how low would it have to go?
So, let me use it as the prairie of Kansas is probably the best example I can come up with in the U.S. It can get down into the 20s, even lower than that. As long as there's a little bit of snowfall on top of winter wheat, it does fine. Snow actually insulates it. The worst thing that happens in Kansas is the fact that they'll plant it, they'll have really cold temperatures and zero snowfall because the wheat is open and those cold winds cause problems. So if you can get it insulated, you're okay. But it can go down into the 20s. And then insulated, it can go even lower than that. So it can handle relatively cold temperatures, you know. Most other plants would just, if you did that. Well, so here's the value of winter wheat, though, is think about it. I've grown it up to here. When the temperature starts going, it's already at, 3, 4, 5 inches tall, 6 inches tall. In spring planted wheat, I don't even put the seed in the ground until the temperature starts warming up. So that means the spring planted wheat is 6 inches behind the other. Because it still gets harvested about the same time. Notice up here in the north, there's no harvest date. Most likely the harvest date is somewhere in this August, September time frame. Just left off the... All right. So let's start by talking about planting. When we get ready to plant, the first thing that we're going to do is probably plow the soil. In this case, the plow is nothing more than a relatively large metal implement, usually. The concept of the plow is the fact that it digs down in and it takes the soil, lifts it, and flips it. Okay? That's all the plow is. One of the biggest problems with the plow, however, is when it does that, it creates a soil surface which is relatively fluffy and cloddy. And when it comes time to plant wheat, we actually don't like fluffy and cloddy. In fact, with wheat, which is relatively a small seed, and for those of you who've never seen a wheat seed, I'll show you some tomorrow. Wheat is relatively small, in which case it is very critical that we have a good, solid seed bed to plant into. What I mean by a good, solid seed bed is that I want a seed bed which is generally smooth, firm, and free of clods. Now, the reason why I want that is because it's something that I like to call seed-soil contact. And it's based on what it is that a seed needs to germinate. You guys know what the 3 things are that are required for a seed to germinate? Water's one. Needs oxygen. And warm. Needs temperature. Okay. Actually doesn't need nutrients. Because for a seed, it has everything that it needs to initiate growth. So what I need is I need water, oxygen, and temperature. Okay? Now, if I go through and I plow my soil, right, and I make this soil really fluffy and full of clods, okay, I'm going to take this seed and I'm going to put it in that environment. Well, if it's really full of clods, you're going to have to kind of follow me here for a second. Imagine, I guess, if you take a whole bunch of rocks and put them into a container and then fill it with water, right? Within it, okay, you have a whole bunch of large spaces, right? Because the clods come together, and because the way they fit together, they don't fit together really close. And they leave these really large gaps. Well, the nice thing about large gaps is the fact that large gaps can hold tons of oxygen, but almost no water. And so what happens? I put the seed in. The seed gets into one of these large pores. It gets plenty of oxygen, might get warm enough to germinate, but if it doesn't have enough water, germination can't start. Okay? So what do? I come in and I beat the soil down. I make it so that it is smooth, firm, and free of clods. I break down those clods so that the soil creates smaller pore spaces. In smaller pore spaces, I can hold a good amount of water, a good amount of oxygen, and maintain good heat. If I plant into that, my germination percentage increases. Now, there is a chance that I actually over-firm it. What I mean by over-firming is it's kind of like if I take a really fluffy soil and I continuously walk over it, what happens? I create this really hard surface. You can kind of imagine that hard surface is almost being like cement. Well, if I take that seed and I plant it into that, all of the seed ends up sitting on top. And think about it. If I put the seed on top, it's just like putting it into a really fluffy, cloddy soil. Because again, it gets plenty of oxygen, gets plenty of temperature because the sun's beating on it. It doesn't get a whole heck of a lot of moisture. So again, my germination percentage goes down. What I need is a soil. It's not too hard and not too fluffy. It needs to be relatively free of clods, and the smoother it is, tends to work a little bit better. Smoothness is kind of a funny one. So what do? Well, after I come through and I plow it, what I could do is use what I call the plank. And all the plank really is one solid piece that you could basically pull across the soil. And as it goes across the soil, what's it going to do? It's going to pound it down. Any clods that it's going to hit, it's going to break apart. Okay? But there's a problem. And the problem is that if you look at what this is going to do to the soil, it has kind of a bulldozering effect. Right? It's going to kind of hit anything that's too tall, and it's just going to kind of bulldoze through it. It could create a problem. I actually don't like things like that. I like when I'm working the soil, I like it to kind of flow with it a little bit. But if everything works well, what I want is I want to have a soil that when I step in it, after I've worked, it has a little bit of give. I drive my students crazy. When they go out and work fields before we start planting, I'll make big footsteps going across the field at a diagonal, and it'll drive them crazy because they want it to be nice and firm and look pretty as you look across it. And here's these, boot lines going across. They always get mad at me. They say, "What the hell are you doing?" I say, "I'm checking firmness." Because what I'll do is I'll just walk across at an angle, and if I step down and my foot sinks in, that's too fluffy. Work it again. If I walk across and I don't sink at all, you guys firmed it too much. Work it again. I want to be able to step down and have just a little bit of a give. Everybody always looks at me like I'm crazy. You'll know what I mean when you feel it. We'll try it tomorrow. I'll see if I can get a piece that's perfect for you. But, you'll go down maybe a half an inch, maybe an inch. A really fluffy soil, you'll drop 2 inches. A hard soil is like walking on cement. It's a feel thing. If it has a little bit of give, your seed's probably going to sit in it nicely. That's all we're looking for. And the plank is one way to do it, but I think there's a better way. So let's talk about some low-tech improvements. I started thinking about what do I do if I have a really cloddy soil? In the U.S., if I have a really cloddy soil, I use what's called a harrow. And a harrow is great because it has little tines, and the tines, as it goes across the ground, kind of drags. And as it hits, it kind of breaks things up. So it'll hit a clod and kind of break it apart. And it kind of has a leveling effect too. It kind of drags. Well, I'm not saying in Afghanistan you need to go out and buy a harrow, because there's simple items that do exactly the same thing. This is just a series of logging chains. Chains work great. If you ever dragged a chain across the ground, it'll kind of roll and kind of bounce. Works great. Doesn't have a big firming effect, but man, when it comes to clods, it'll beat them to death. And if you don't like that, how about a good old-fashioned chain link fence? I actually pull a chain link fence behind my planter. We'll talk about why later on. It deals with seed soil contact. Chain link fences work great for breaking up clods and leveling. If you don't believe me, go to any baseball diamond at your local park. Because in between innings, they'll come out and run across the field with a chain link fence. Because that chain link fence just kind of flows. Knock down clods, smooth it out. Works great. The problem is neither one of these have much of a firming effect. But they don't have a bulldozering effect. If you want firming, we use what's called a field roller. Cultipacker is the other way to call it. Field rollers work great. A little bit of weight, run across it, press it down. Again, you don't have to buy a field roller. You can just make one. This is the coolest one I found. Guy took probably about 1 foot or 12-inch diameter drainage line, plastic, filled it with cement, ran a rod through the middle of it. Does exactly the same thing that does. If you don't want that, how about a 55-gallon drum? Now, admittedly, in parts of Afghanistan, you probably don't want a 55-gallon drum sitting around. However, if that's not your security issue, a 55-gallon drum is a wonderful field roller. One of the great things about a 55-gallon drum is you control the weight. If it's too light, add water. Too heavy, take water out. You can control how much water it needs. Both of these work really good at compressing the soil. Okay? And I think do a much better job than the way the plank would work. The other thing was somebody told me that in some parts they have seen people use tree limbs. Because you think about a tree limb, if you take off a tree limb, and it has it with just the small branches coming off, it kind of has a rake effect, but it's heavy enough. Work on the same exact principle. Instead of dragging like the plank, it would actually kind of break things up as it goes. Has a better ability to kind of walk with the soil. I think that's important. Okay. Any questions? All right. So once we have our seed bed ready, let's talk about seed. And I think one of the first questions is, and you guys have probably already talked about this, is where do you get your seed? In a report in 2003, they said 58% of all seed was farmer saved. This is like what I told you before. What do I mean by that? It means that if I am an Afghan wheat farmer, I'm going to go out and I'm going to plant wheat this year. I'm going to harvest this upcoming summer. And when I harvest, I am going to take all of that grain, put it in storage. I'm going to feed my family off of it. And when it comes time to plant, I'm going to go into that granary and I'm going to take some seed out of it and I'm going to use that same seed to plant back next year. Okay? So 58% of all the seed that the farmer uses to plant this year came from last year's crop. If, however, he runs out of seed, he can obtain seed from the local bazaar. So about 40% of the seed all came from the local bazaar. So that means that he ran out of seed. He goes to the local bazaar when it's time to plant. He finds somebody who's selling grain. He buys that grain, and that's going to be the grain that he uses to plant his fields. The last 2% comes from those humanitarian organizations. The main one we're going to talk about is CIMMYT. It's the Maize and Wheat Research Group. Okay.
Do you know anything about crop reports? I know that they're doing government's seed distribution.
There is some. I do know that somebody told me that there was some. I don't have a whole heck of a lot of information about it. One of the problems that we're going to talk about, however, with that is that I am a little concerned about where that seed originated from. At one point, somebody mentioned that there was a group that was introducing seeds that were not adapted to Afghanistan.
They were like a hybrid, and
Yeah,
didn't germinate.
they didn't do very well in Afghanistan.
Last year, one of the donors was India.
Was it? Okay. See, in India, it should do better. If you were to, and it's kind of what we had just talked about a little bit ago, is that if you were to grab a variety from the U.S. and take it to Afghanistan, it wouldn't do very well because most of the wheat that we produce in the U.S. requires a fair amount of nitrogen fertilizer. And so if you were to take it and plant it in Afghanistan, it would grow, but it wouldn't grow very well because it's designed to grow in high-yielding environments. So you have to be very careful, and we'll talk about that actually.
I was going to say, if anyone knows like legalities of wheat seed distribution, because I know that there were some teams that
Yeah, and they were trying to control it, I think, because somebody.
no, I wasn't down there, but
Yeah, at one point, somebody mentioned to me that they had all but stopped most of it in most parts of the country. So that's about as far as I knew. So one thing that I think you need to understand about this, however, is that with all of this, actually, I guess, with all of this, one of the questions that has to be asked is what is the quality of that seed? If I had seed in my pocket, I could pull it out and hand it to you, and I could ask you one simple question: is it alive or dead? And you could look at it. Could you tell me? Probably not. Just to look at seed, you can't tell. And in fact, at one point in time, we had a discussion that somebody had tried something that we're going to talk about in a second on some seed that they had purchased from the local bazaar. And the quality of the seed in terms of planting a crop was marginal at best. Actually, I think he said it was less than marginal. So at some point, we're going to have to figure out how do we test the quality of our seed. And I will show you an example of what we can do.
I have a quick question. Is it the quality, or let's say, to be alive or dead, is it the way that they're storing it that could cause it to die off, or is there something that we need to know about? You see the farmer and you go, okay, how do you store your seed? What's the proper way of doing that?
Storage is going to be one of them. We'll talk about that one, but it's also how you manage it and produce it. We'll also talk about that. So I think there are some things that we can do to improve the quality of our seed. And I think most of that is all going to be handled under this kind of best management practices. So we'll get to it, I promise. One more thing before I go on, and this actually kind of comes back to the question we just had, was that we're going to talk about, farmers saved. And the farmers saved, what we're talking about are land races. Land races are varieties that have been in country for decades. Okay? On the flip side of that, you have the modern varieties. The modern varieties are going to be these varieties that are coming in from places like India, the U.S., or Mexico from CIMMYT. Okay? Those are the modern varieties. And one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is, which is the best seed to plant? And one of those answers that just annoys everybody is that the answer to that question is well, it depends. So I'm going to give you two stories. Okay? The first one deals with a land race a modern variety called Inquilab 91. So several years ago, CIMMYT produced a variety called Inquilab 91. They gave it to a grower to do as a trial. And so the farmer planted it in a field that was side by side. So on the top side of this field, he planted a landrace. On the bottom side, he planted Inquilab 91. A couple things for you to know about this. Number one, this farmer was doing dry land wheat. Okay? That's the first thing. Number two, this grower was using a machine to plant. Most of the wheat that's going to be planted is not going to be planted by wheat. Most of it's going to be done by broadcast. All right? So that's the second thing to remember. Third thing that I'll let you know is that the farmer planted both of these plots, the Landrace and Ecolab 91, on exactly the same day. So, let me ask you a question. If you were a grower and you go out to this field and you look, which variety are you going to plant? Landrace or Ecolab 91? Landrace. Why?
Because it's already big.
It's growing. Yeah, it's growing. In this case, the Landrace kicked the modern variety's butt. And here's why. The farmer knew how to grow the Landrace. Over generations or decades or whatever, the farmer recognized the fact that this Landrace could actually germinate from deep in the soil. When you grow a dry land variety, what you tend to do is you take that seed and you plant it as deep into the soil as you can. Because what you want to do is you want to get that seed down to where there's moisture. Which is also important to mention that he did it by a planter. So he set his planter as deep as it could go. He got it down there. He got the seed planted all the way down into moisture. Because down where there was moisture, the seed could germinate. And the plant was able to grow up through that depth. Ecolab 91 was designed to be grown in irrigated fields. In an irrigated field, you don't plant as deep. Because you don't have to find moisture. You're going to give it moisture. So you plant it relatively shallow. Well, so what happened is when he took Ecolab 91 and he put it down deep, Ecolab 91 didn't have the energy to push up through that depth. And eventually, most of the Ecolab 91 died before it got out of the ground. I will tell you, just to kind of finish the story, Ecolab 91 does finally come up. Its total productivity was much lower, okay, because not all of the plants came up. But it did eventually produce, but didn't produce near to the level the Landrace did. In this example, the Landrace was a known variety. The grower knew what he could do with it and how to grow it. And it was designed to grow well in that environment. In this exact example, the Landrace was far better than the modern variety. But is that always the case? Next story. Several years ago, a disease moved into, well, the world actually. It's called UG99. Came out of Uganda. And it was a stem rust of wheat. Now here's the thing about a stem rust of wheat. If stem rusts move in, it will absolutely annihilate the crop. And when UG99 first came in, every single wheat variety was susceptible. That meant it didn't matter what wheat I planted. If UG99 was present, it was dead. Because what happens is UG99, it comes in, and it starts producing these rust pustules. And eventually, it basically just knocks out the plant's ability to photosynthesize. And eventually, the plant dies. UG99 was terrible. When it first came in, they said, oh my, wheat production in the world is going to end. Because nothing is resistant. Well, enter the geneticists from CIMMYT. They say, you know what? No, we can overcome this. And they started to develop new varieties of wheat which were capable of surviving a UG99 infection. And eventually, they developed one. They represent the only wheat varieties which are currently resistant to UG99. Which means that if you are going to be in an area which is going to get UG99, you better be planting the modern variety, which is UG99 resistant. Because none of the land races are. Now here's the scary thing about rusts. Rust diseases travel an amazing distance. They are wind carried. To give you kind of an idea of a rust disease problem, we can predict the amount of rust in Minnesota by the total amount of rust in Mexico the year before. Because what happens is when we start harvesting in Mexico, the rust spores get into the air, they're carried by the jet stream or up by the air currents, up across the plains, and are finally deposited in Mexico or in Minnesota. They can cover great distances. In fact, the one group saw that UG99 was moving towards the border of Afghanistan, and they started to plant UG99 resistant varieties. And something amazing happened. UG99 got to the border of Afghanistan and turned right and missed it. So currently, UG99, not a huge problem in Afghanistan, luckily. Somebody's asked, however, does that mean it's never going to be a problem? Oh, hell no. Eventually, the winds are going to shift. UG99 will get carried. Just right now, we have a stay of execution. But if you're in a place that UG99 has been reported, my suggestion, find some UG99 resistant plants. Because if you don't, that's what your field's going to look like. And its total productivity is going to be in the dirt. Okay? So in that case, modern variety, way better than the landrace. So again, which one's better? Modern variety or landrace? Well, depends. What are you going to do? All right. So let's talk about seed for a second. One thing that I want you to understand is that the seed is your crop. What do I mean? I mean that if I have an area to grow, so right here, I have this one table, okay? This table I can grow my crop. Let's say that this table holds exactly 100 seeds. If I plant out 100 seeds, but only 50 of them are alive, what's my total productivity? 50%. The seed is your crop. If I plant dead seed, I get no crop. So somehow or another, I am going to have to improve the quality of my seeds. Here's the other thing, too. I don't just need living seeds. I need seeds that grow fast. We call it vigorous. A vigorous plant is one that is growing rapidly. Vigor is a wonderful thing. Because as it turns out, a seed which grows vigorously tends to grow and outcompete things like weeds, insects, and diseases. If I have a plant that is struggling to survive, that is the first plant that'll get shaded out by a weed, that'll get eaten by an insect, or decimated by a disease. So if I can get a seed that grows fast, I can usually overcome most of my plant pests. A little harder to overcome a rat or a mouse. We'll talk about those. Yes, ma'am.
So I know that the older seed is, the less, its chance of germinating
Goes down.
goes down. How long, how quickly does that happen for wheat seed? Like how long can wheat seed be stored before it?
Depends on how you store it. And see, there I go again. I'm using depend. And I apologize. Well-stored seed, I will tell you, can be stored for decades. Poorly stored seed, dead in a month. So it depends on how you're going to store it. And I'll give you some examples on good ways to store and really bad ways to store. All right, so before we can talk about lawns, though, let's finish talking about wheat. A couple things for you guys to take away from the seed discussion is the fact that And this kind of goes back to quality seed. What do I mean by quality seed? And a while ago, actually, I think it was Paul that asked me this question. He goes, why do you think that in the U.S. we've done such a good job with our agricultural production? And I said, well, one of the reasons why I think dealt with how we've kind of produced our crops. And the best example that I have is actually in corn production. So bear with me for a second. I'll explain how all this works. Okay, is that really the best way to produce is to use a little bit of observation. Observation, looking at things, is going to be the most important thing that we can do to improve our total productivity. Corn growers recognized this years ago. Back in the day when they used to harvest corn, they would go in and they would harvest corn by hand. And when you would harvest corn by hand, you would come through, you'd grab an ear, you'd pull it off, you'd shuck it, you'd look at the ear, and you'd make a snap decision. You would look at that ear, and if that ear was decent but not great, you would throw the ear into the wagon. However, if you were going through and you came across an ear that was larger, the kernels were bigger, instead of throwing it into the wagon, you would take that ear and you'd put it into this box. This wagon was to eat. This box was to plant. What they were doing was they were selecting the best ears. Now, what were they doing when they were selecting the best ears? Well, they weren't necessarily selecting the plants because of their genetic differences or anything like that. What they were doing was they were selecting the plants that were actually growing in the ideal environment. Because here's the thing, if I grow a bunch of plants, right, by chance alone, I could have an area that sits a little bit lower, the soil's a little richer, it has a little bit more water. As that plant grows, it's going to be fed more. When it's fed more, you know what that plant does? It produces a larger fruit, a larger seed. It puts more energy into the seed. Well, here's the thing. A larger seed tends to be a higher quality, more vigorous seed. So if I can select for seeds which are larger, plumper, bigger, I get a faster growing plant. So what they were doing was they were selecting for the largest seeds. And they did it by looking. And I think we can actually do it in wheat. Imagine, you walk out. This room represents our field of wheat. Over in that corner over there, there's a little bit of a little wet patch. The wheat over in that corner gets a little bit more water. Maybe it's up close to my animal enclosure, so it's getting a little bit of manure as well. Maybe it gets a little bit more sun. When I look out at the field, I see that the plants in that corner over there are a little deeper green. Maybe they're a little bit taller as well. Well, so what I say is take that corner where the plants are a little taller, a little greener, a little healthier looking, and kind of rope it off. When harvest comes, come in and harvest the rest of the field, leaving behind that one corner. A couple weeks later, after everything else has been harvested and run through the thrasher, go through and harvest that. Take that seed and stick it somewhere else. Because I just about will guarantee you that seed will be of higher quality than everything else. And all you did was select based on how it looked. We just did exactly what they did. We selected the part of the field that was the best growing part of the field. And that's where we selected our seed. Just looking can do a lot. Now, looking when it's growing is key. But it doesn't mean it's the only thing that we can do. If I get there and they've already harvested, it's amazing what you can tell by looking at the seed that comes out of a field. When my students are harvesting, I'll have them go in and they'll start harvesting seed. They'll get about a quarter of the way done with their first pass, and I'll shut them down. And I'll come in, I'll reach my hand into the grain tank, and I'll pull it out, the seed, and I'll look at it. Because it's amazing what you can tell by looking at the seed. Because I'll sit there and I'll take it. And I usually, what I'll do is I'll get a fairly good-sized handful. I'll kind of move it around. Usually I'll blow across it a little bit, try to get rid of anything that's light. And what I'll do is I'll sit there and I'll look. And the first thing I'll do is I'll look for broken seeds. If I see a whole bunch of seeds which are cracked or broken, then we're doing something wrong. A cracked or broken seed tends to not germinate, and if it does, tends to get diseased quickly. Mostly because here you have this opening that a disease can get into. And insects love them. So if I have a whole bunch of broken or cracked seeds, might be great for me to grind and produce flour. I'm not going to use it to plant. The next thing that I'll do is I'll check my seed size. A good batch of seed has a uniform size. If, however, I start to see smalls and bigs, well, then there's something wrong. It means I maybe harvested too early in some cases. So I want a relatively uniform size. And remember, all the time, I'm looking for larger seed. Larger the seed, the better. Okay? Small seeds sometimes are just immatures. Seeds which just really didn't have enough time to grow. Again, an immature seed might still be fine for making flour, but it's not going to be a plant or a seed that I'm going to want to plant. Last, what's the purity? When I pull out a handful, all I should see are wheat seeds. I don't want to see any weeds. If I start seeing weed seeds, definitely don't want to use it to plant next year. Because why in the world would I want to take wheat and plant the same problem that I'm going to have this year? So if I start to see a whole bunch of weeds, they're going to have to fix it. I also start looking around for insects and diseases. Insects and diseases are relatively easy to find. Insects, they like to get in and bore out the middle of the seed. They're really after the oils. They take a little bit of the carbohydrate. But what happens is the insect gets in there, it'll bore out the inside of it, and the seed gets really light. It usually gets light enough that if you're holding it like this and you just blow on it, insect damaged seeds will usually just fly away because they have no weight. If when I look in my hand, I see seeds, well, actually, they don't even look like seeds. If you ever see things that look like mouse or rabbit pellet or rat droppings, usually those are not mouse or rat droppings. Those are usually diseased seeds. They produce what they call sclerotia. The disease comes in and it causes the seed to swell. Usually turns kind of this blackish gray color. There's a great story related to that deals with the Salem witch trials, but we don't have time to talk about it. But I can kind of look at it just using my eyes, and I can pick out things. And it's not that hard. Tomorrow, we'll steal some seed from one of the other instructors, Hanny, and you guys will look, and I'll show you what it is that you can pick out. And realize the seed we're going to look at isn't stuff that's coming out of a field. It's stuff that's already been cleaned. But you can still see the differences. All right? But I think just by using our eyes, we can select for quality seed. If the plant is growing, I can select the region or the area of the field that grows the best and use that. If it's already been harvested, I can use my eyes to look at the seed from the field, and I might be able to pick out parts just based on what I see in my hand that I would want to use for my seed for next year. all about what you can see. All right? Any questions on that? All right. So after I've harvested my seed, what I need to try and do is do some basic seed cleaning. Seed cleaning is really important. Because if I can get my seed clean, it means that I can get rid of things like plant material, rocks and dirt, weed seeds, dead insects, and any number of other possibilities. The bad part about these, especially plant materials and rocks and dirt, is the fact that plant materials and rocks and dirt tend to hold moisture. When I store seed, I don't want moisture. I want my seed to be relatively dry. Because moisture is going to do two things. One, it's going to initiate germination, which is bad. And two, it's going to bring in molds, which is also bad. So if I can get rid of that stuff, I can improve the quality of my stored seed. The easiest way to clean seed is a process known as winnowing. Almost everybody's seen winnowing, they just didn't know that's what it was called. Winnowing is the use of wind to remove light materials. Works really well for plant materials, insect damaged seed. And the reason for it is that the way that winnowing works is if you were to take a pan of seed and put it so that the wind is at your back. If you take this pan and you throw the seed up in the air, when you throw it up, you try to create a single, layer of seed thrown up. You can see it here. As the wind comes through, anything which is light gets blown away. Anything which is heavy falls down. So just by tossing it up in the air, I can get rid of most of my problems. Rocks and dirt, a little bit harder to get rid of. Not overly complicated, though. If you have a lot of rocks and dirt, I always tell my students use the panning for gold method. They always look at me kind of crazy. If you were to take seed that has a whole bunch of rocks and dirt, if you just put it into a dish, in fact, what we had was it's called a grape lug. It's about that long, about that high, solid plastic. They poured a bunch of seed into it, and there's a bunch of rocks and dirt in it. They said, "What are we going to do?" I said, "Well, clean it." And so the students sat down in a chair, and they started picking out rocks and dirt. I'm like, "Guys, there's an easier way than to do that." They said, "No way, there's no easier way." I said, "I'll bet you I can clean this before you guys can clean that one." They said, "Deal." So we got a pan, and they got theirs, and they sat down in their chair, and they started going through it. I took my pan, held it at a slight angle, and started shaking it. And what happened? Started to separating by weight. Light stuff went to the bottom, heavy stuff went to the top. Shook it for a little while, laid it flat, grabbed a big handful of rocks and dirt, threw it out, lifted it up, did it again, did it 3 times. In like 5 minutes, probably less than that, had my bucket perfectly clean. They were still picking. It's not that hard to clean seed. You just got to take the time. Getting those rocks and dirt out meant that I could keep that seed better. More protected. Not that hard to clean. The other way to do it is to use a screen. Naveed says that screens are actually available. If you look at what a screen is, I'll show you a couple of them tomorrow. What it is that it's a piece of material. In the case that I have tomorrow, they are metal. That if you dump your seed on, seed of the right size will fall through. Anything which is too large will stay on top. And so what you can do is you can pour your seed on, shake your screen. Seed that is the right size falls through. Seed which is too large, or materials which are too large, stay on top. Run all your seed through, throw away what's on top. The other thing that you can do is do it in reverse. You can make it so that anything which is smaller than your seed will fall through and your seed stays on top. So if you have two screens, you can actually clean it down to something that is of uniform size and shape. In fact, if you have a seed screen, you could actually select for larger seed size. One of the suggestions that I make is that if you could find the right size screen, you could go to that seed that you've harvested from your field. You could take a bucket of it. You could pour it across the screen. You could shake the screen. And if the screen is the right size, some seed will fall through, and let's say 10% of the seed stays on top. So what you're doing is you're selecting for the 10% largest seed. Well, if you do that, you can actually segregate out the big seed from everything else. And here's the great thing about everything else. Everything else, still good to eat, just not necessarily great to plant. So if you run it across the screen, you could select that 10%, which is good, 90% that you can eat. Didn't need observation. Biggest problem with screens, however, is that in order for this to work, is you have to have enough screens to do it. If you go into my seed lab back in San Luis, I have one whole wall that is dedicated to different screen sizes. Because as it turns out, the seed that I produce, the 10% largest seed this year, is different than the 10% largest seed from last year, and it's probably different in size than the 10% largest from next year. Because depending on the environment, temperature, water, light, my seed size is going to change. So that is one of the problems. I do know, however, in talking to Naveed, the screens are available. Because if you're going to go and grind seed for flour, you don't want to grind rocks. It's not good on a grinding stone. So you're going to run it through a screen. So the screens are probably available, just a matter of selecting the right screens to do it. All right? Okay. Questions? Comments? All right. So after I have the seed cleaned, there is a simple test that we can do to test the germination. In fact, it is so simple. We call it the rolled paper towel test. The reason why we call it the rolled paper towel test is because, well, you take a paper towel and you roll it. Here's how it works. What you basically do is you take something. Paper towel works the best because a paper towel will hold a fair amount of water. You don't have to do a paper towel. In fact, a piece of paper will work because a piece of paper will hold water, right? So here's what you're going to do. You're going to take something like a piece of paper and you're going to get it wet. Okay? And once you get it nice and wet, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to take your seed and you're going to lay it out on your piece of paper. After that, you're going to roll it up. Once you have it rolled up, what I like to do is I like to take it and put it into like a Ziploc bag. Because the great thing about a Ziploc bag is it holds moisture. But it doesn't have to be a Ziploc bag. You could probably put it into a water bottle that has no water left in it. Seal it. You want something that has a relatively high humidity. Something that keeps the moisture. After you set it up, you then leave it on a shelf, walk away from it for 5 days, maybe 7. 5 days, 7 days later, come back, take it out, unroll it, count the number of seeds that have germinated. If I put 100 seeds on it and 75 of them germinate, then my germination percentage, 75%. If I put 100 seeds on it and 50 of them germinate, then my germination percentage is 50%. I know what the quality of my seed is. Now here's one of the things that we've talked about before in this class, is the fact that this is one of those simple tests that are so easy to show somebody. Because what you can do is you can go in and you can start talking to a grower. You can ask for a little bit of seed. You bring out a paper towel, you put it on, you set it up, you roll it up, you put it in a plastic bottle or a Ziploc bag, and here's what you do. When it's time to go, you hand it to them. You say, I'll be back in 5 days. Let them keep it. Let them hold on to it. In 5 days, you come back and you unroll it with them. And as you unroll it, you show them which ones germinated and which ones didn't. The nice thing about it is that it's so visual. I have one I set up on Sunday, and I'll show it to you tomorrow. You can see immediately whether or not it grew or not. Okay? And so you can immediately kind of describe or show what is the quality of the seed that you have. You can use this test for vigor. Remember we told you about vigor? How fast does it grow? What you can do is set up the test exactly the same way, except instead of leaving it for 5 days, in 2 days, come back and count the number of seeds that have initiated germination. Those seeds that have initiated germination, usually I just pick off and throw away. Roll up the remaining, leave it on the shelf for another day or two. Come back, unroll it, count the number of seeds which have germinated in 4 days. Throw those away. Roll it back up. Leave it 2 more days. Come back. Unroll it. Count the number of seeds that germinated on the 6th day. If you find out that there is a batch of seed that the largest percentage of them germinated in 4 days, that's really vigorous. If you have a batch of seed where the majority of them germinated in 8 days, that's really low vigor. It's not perfect, but at least it gives you an idea of what's going on. One other thing is somebody asked me one time, is it better to do testing before you plant or after you harvest? What do you guys think? In this case, at least that first couple of times, the answer is both. And here's why. I go through and I grow it and I harvest, right? I have this seed. I go in, I do a germination test, and I find out that right after I harvest, my germination percentage is 85%. I take my seed and I put it in the storeroom. Comes time to plant, I come out, I grab the seed, I do another germination test. I find out that when I take it out of storage, it only germinates at 50%. What did I just learn? My storage procedures stink. The first couple of times, my suggestion is do it both. Right at harvest, right at planting. Because if you use it, you'll figure out where you're going wrong. If, however, if you test it at harvest and you test it right before planting and the germination percentage are basically the same, you're storing it well. At that point, I'd probably only check it at planting. All right?
Yeah, so just to add on, guys, if you're looking for a kind of icebreaker, not only with the community, but maybe for the Dale, we've heard over these last couple of days, it's very hard to sometimes to connect up with the Dale. But the Dale's also looking for how to look good with the community. I think this towel test is something you should really keep in your toolkit, because as you say, they can measure it over time. It's very participatory. You can get the young folks or whoever in the family to try this towel test. There's no funny business because they keep it right at the farm, so they're in control of it. And there's lots of teaching moments for the Dale with this. As you say, if the storage shows a big drop, there's a teaching opportunity there.
Right.
Okay, let's see how you improve the quality of your seed or your storage methods. So it's relatively easy, and it could be a big winner for you, I think, in breaking ice.
Absolutely, and it's so easy. I mean, we'll demonstrate it tomorrow. It'll probably take me a grand total of 5 minutes or less to set it up. So, really, really simple. Any other questions on this? Okay. So let's talk for a second about seed storage. So we've had this question already about seed storage. Let's talk about it for a second. Properly stored seed really does improve the quality of that seed. If I store seed incorrectly, I will have over time a loss of seed viability. I can increase pest pressures, especially insects and diseases. And eventually I will lower my germination. And usually this happens because of humidity on one hand or just straight up moisture on the other. Okay, all of those will definitely lower my total germination percentage. If I'm trying to figure out what the proper seed storage environment is, we actually teach people to follow what's called the rule of thumb. And the rule of thumb is this in seed. And I realize you guys are going to find this to be strange, but bear with me for a second. The perfect environment to store seed is when the temperature in Fahrenheit plus the humidity in percentage is less than 100. I know that sounds kind of strange, but if you go to a seed storage facility, I take my students to a seed storage facility up in Northern California. We walk in and it's a huge facility, and one of their rooms is set up to store seed. And when you walk in, the temperature in the room is about 69 degrees Fahrenheit. And the percent moisture, or the humidity, sits right about 30%. And I always point it out to my students. I go, what is it? Add it up. Less than 100. They will store it in there for over a year with almost no drop in germination percentage at that point. Okay? So ideally, if I can follow this, I can store seed for an amazing amount of time. Thanks, Paul. Now, in Afghanistan, you're already above in the temperature, right? In the summertime. Your temperatures are probably going to exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, as it turns out, that's not as big of a deal. Because in fact, the biggest problem that you're going to have is if you have really high temperatures at really high humidity. What's the humidity in Afghanistan? In the summertime. When the temperatures are high, humidity is relatively low, right? And so, for the most part, most of the seed should be able to be stored appropriately, assuming that it's not stored in direct sunlight. And the reason for it is that really high temperatures in direct sunlight, you actually do run the risk of getting the temperature high enough that you will over-dry the seed. And over-drying the seed is kind of like baking it. It's kind of like if you were to, if you like to make pumpkin seeds in the fall, what do? You bake them, right? You pull them out and you bake them. And what happens? As you bake them, you desiccate them. So they crunch. If you were to take that seed and plant it, it would never grow because it's too dry. So if I take seeds, store them in the sunlight, and the temperatures are really high, I'm going to kill them. I'm going to bake them. So if I can, if the temperatures are extremely high, my humidity is low, as long as I store them in an environment where they're not in direct sunlight and have a little bit of airflow around them, I can usually store them for a long period of time. If I can, the best place for me to store seed is actually in some kind of mesh bag. And generally speaking, if I'm going to store it, I'm going to store it where it's slightly elevated off of the ground. My favorite place to store seed is actually on a pallet. So if I have a pallet, I'll put down a pallet and I'll put seed on top of it. That way I get airflow underneath it. And then when I bring it in and I put it inside, I won't put it directly against the wall. I'll move it off maybe 6 inches. Because what I want is I want airflow to go all the way around that seed on all directions. Because if I get a certain amount of airflow, I can usually keep the humidity low. So even if it's inside, where humidity tends to increase, as long as I have airflow, I'm usually okay. And so I can store it for at least a year. Question?
Yeah, well, you mentioned you store it in a mesh bag.
Yes.
I assume that it needs to be a really fine mesh.
It does need to be a fine mesh bag. Hanny tomorrow, when he talks about post-harvest, he'll give you some examples. The thing that I don't like, and one of the things is that sometimes they'll tell you to put it in like a bucket or a jar. And a bucket and a jar are fine, assuming that your seed moisture is low enough. If your seed moisture is too high and you put it into a closed container, it will just increase humidity. You'll increase molds, rots, and amazingly enough, most people don't realize this, if you take wet seed and put them in a closed container, eventually the seed will actually catch on fire. It'll actually get hot enough that it can ignite. And usually what happens then is it's a buildup of fungus that create heat, and eventually it goes into what's called an exothermic reaction, and boom. So you have to be very careful about making sure that the seed is of the right moisture. When I first harvest, I want to put it into some kind of container that allows air to get through it. After it's dried down, I can put it into a closed container. But not before then. And we'll talk a little bit about moisture. The best way to tell the moisture of a seed is when you harvest it, if you pop it in your mouth and bite down on it, if it crunches, it's dry. If it squishes, it's not. Okay? So the easiest way to tell whether or not it's ready, pop it in your mouth. Wheat will crunch. If it squishes, compresses, squirts, it's way too wet. Wait. Okay? If I can pop it in my mouth and it crunches, we're probably okay to put it in a sealed container. However, I usually would still wait a little bit.
Jeff, I think that example you just brought up about the storage bags, just as you say, simply moving it off the wall and off the ground. See, that's what we're talking about, folks. Those are simple tweaks that can make a difference, yes? It's something
Very.
we already practiced,
Yep.
and it's something that's so easy to do, and it can make a difference. And I think those are the kinds of things people would say, hey, that's cool.
Yeah.
That guy's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's really simple. And if you're really, truly worried about storing seed, the best place to store seed is about 6 feet under the ground. So if I can, after it's dry enough, if I can take it, put it into a sealed container, dig a hole about 6 feet down, put it in, bury it up, seed will last a long time. In fact, Hanny and I always laugh at the fact that when they first opened up the pyramids, they found some seed. They took it out. They did a germination test on it, and it actually still germinated. Seed stored in proper conditions can last a long, long time. Was it perfect germination? No. It was like 20%, but I mean, you know, yeah, after how many years was that? I mean, that's still pretty impressive. Had a professor when I was in school that when he retired, right around the time that I was getting ready to graduate, he told us that he wanted us to go dig up his seeds. And we all kind of looked at him like he was crazy. He said, what? He goes, yeah, out in the field I had buried some seeds like 30 or 40 years ago. He says, go dig it up. And we're like, yeah, you're pulling our legs. Well, we did it anyway. We went out there, and yeah, we got down, and he had these old mason jars, and inside of them he had a bunch of corn seed. I said, what the heck? We took it out, started asking questions about how good it was. He says, well, do a germination test. So what did we do? We took it in the lab. We did a rolled paper towel test. That seed germinated like 80%. Been in the ground for 30, 40 years. Sitting about 6 feet, give or take. So if you want to store seed, you can do it that way. Works well. Seed which is stored in the proper temperature and humidity can last a long, long time. All right. All right. So, just really quickly, let's talk about wheat harvest for a second. When they harvest wheat, wheat is going to be harvested when the grain is relatively dry. It'll be brown and ready to go. What they'll usually do is come through, cut it off at the base, and put it into a bundle. Sometimes they'll let the bundle sit for a while, and that's okay. The plant is totally fine to sit. When the time comes, what usually happens is within the village, there's usually somebody that has a small mechanical thrasher. What these thrashers are is PTO driven, so basically off of a tractor, and it basically spins. It runs a small belt. You feed the material in. It removes the seed from the plant, releasing the seed and leaving the straw. The payment for using this is that the people that own the thrasher usually get a small percentage of the seed. The farmer gets the rest of the seed and all the straw. Okay. Now, one of the problems with this here is the fact that this process, if set incorrectly, can be very damaging to seed. If you run it too fast or too hard, you will crack seed. So remember what I told you, if I'm going to select that section of the field to harvest for seed, I said hold on to it for a week or two. Come back to it later. The reason why I wanted you to do that is because if it's sitting there and you harvest it separate from everything else, then it doesn't run through this machine. Because it's really easy to harvest wheat. Once it's dry, if you take that bundle and beat it on the ground, and what they'll usually do is they'll put down some kind of mat or a towel, some kind of cloth, and you'll basically just beat that bundle on the ground. When it hits, it releases the seed. The nice thing about that system of removing the seed is it's very gentle on the seed. The likelihood of cracking seed that way is much, much lower. So that means that, when I selected that corner and I harvested for seed, if I go through and I harvest it and I thrash it by hand, it means every single seed is going to come off in the highest quality possible. If, however, I take that area and I run it through, some of my seed is going to get cracked. And what did we say about cracked seed? It can get diseased and tends not to grow very well. So we're not going to talk a whole heck of a lot about harvest. That's about all I'm going to say about it. You guys have any questions on wheat harvest? Last thing is soil and soil fertility. And probably one of the most important things for you to realize, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, is the fact that most Afghan farmers have very little access to fertilizers. And though we in the U.S. would say that's a horrible thing, it's actually not a bad thing at all. Because fertilizers introduce a lot of problems. And we'll talk about those in a second. In fact, what we want to be able to do in Afghanistan is not necessarily give them fertilizer. I think what we want to do instead is improve the total amount of organic matter within their soil. Organic matter is a wonderful thing because soils that have high organic matter tend to produce better. Might be hard to see, but this right here on this side, so you can see there's a line right here. This side right here is a low organic matter soil. If you look at it, it has really cloddy texture to it. Its total quality in terms of productivity is much lower. Its soil structure is bad. It doesn't hold water really well because it has these large clods. And it doesn't allow for great nutrient uptake. If, however, you take this soil and over years you add organic matter to it, and so organic matter is going to be either plant or animal material. If I can add organic matter into that soil, I can alter that soil structure. If you notice this side of the picture now, you can see that though it's not perfect, it still has clods, but it's not near as bad as the other one. Its soil structure is much better. Its productivity is much better. What we can do is increase the total amount of organic matter within our soil. The best way to do it, add manure. Manure is a wonderful thing. Yes?
How long would it take to go from the soil to
When I took over the farm at Cal Poly, all of my soils looked like this. In about 2 to 3 years, we had a huge improvement from this to something more like that. And what we did in that case was we didn't use animal materials at all. We actually used plant materials. So what I would do is at the end of the season, I would plant oats or wheat, something like that. I would grow it up through the winter, and in the springtime, I would run over the top of it with a mower, and then I'd till it in. And all of that plant material was just being added back into the soil. And over time, my organic matter went up. One of the problems that we have in Afghanistan is because the straw has value, we are removing a fair amount of organic matter. We're not removing it all because you still have the roots. The roots actually contain a fair amount of material, but in terms of its total amount, it is less than if I left the whole plant material. One other way that I can add organic matter is to add manure. The problem with the addition of manure is that manure also has a value to them, because dried manure is a great fuel source. So at one time there was a discussion that you could do what's called a compost tea. You guys ever heard of compost tea before? The concept of a compost tea is if I were to take manure, so I gather up all the manure and I put it into a bin. I then add water to that bin. I compress the manure into the water, releasing the nutrients out of the manure. I capture that water, and that water then represents basically a mixture of water and nutrients that flowed out of the manure. I can then take that water and add it to my soil. Every time I add it, I'm adding some of those nutrients. The nice thing about the compost tea idea is that after I've compressed that manure into the water, I can take that manure cake out, dry it in the sun, and it's still a great fuel source because what's left behind is all the fiber that is actual fuel source. But most of the nitrates and everything else that was in the manure is now in the water that I add to my soil. So that might be one way that we can get two benefits. Okay? But the point is that somehow, some way, we need to figure out how to get more material into the soil, not out. Okay? So, if I can increase organic matter, I can do a lot. One way that we kind of get around the issue of organic matter in the U.S. is that we use fertilizer. And fertilizer does do some wonderful things. One of the biggest problems, however, with fertilizer is that most people use the wrong fertilizer in the wrong amount at the wrong time. It's amazing how many people do it, and here comes that section that we can apply to our lawns. Okay. So if you want to have a perfectly green lawn, the most important thing that you can do is to add nitrogen. Lawns are a grass, like wheat. Love nitrogen. But you got to be careful. You got to add nitrogen at the right time in the right amount. If you do it at the wrong time, the nitrogen is not available for the plant during growth. When you want to add it, you want to add it when it's in active growth. It's a good time when it's waking up, kind of needs it. Sometimes needs another shot sometime in the middle of the summer if you're in a place that needs a lot. In wheat, one of the things we have to be careful of is that we cannot add nitrogen too late. Once the wheat plant enters into the flowering stage, any nitrogen that gets added is unable to be used by the plant. It doesn't get there in time.
Can't burn it.
It actually doesn't tend to burn it, it just kind of leaches away. And so what you end up doing is you end up adding fertilizer that you waste. So you got to be real careful. You got to add it at the right time, in the right amount. Most people tend to believe that if a little is good, a lot is better. And sometimes that's not always the right way. In some things, if you add too much, most of it is wasted. In other cases, you can in fact burn it. Except for you probably did more with the herbicide than you did with the fertilizer. One other thing, so for all of you turf want a beautiful green lawn, if you go to the store, you can go and buy like the Scott's Feed and Green, things like that. If you look on it, on the back of it, it'll tell you what the percentage of the different nutrients are. And there's usually 3 numbers. It'll say like 15, 15, 15 or 12, 10, 0 or something like that. And what it's telling you is it's telling you the percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Okay? Actually, and P and K. Phosphorus and then potassium. Yeah, I said that. Okay. So, you can go and you can buy Scott's. And they'll charge you, $10 or $15 per a bag. If you walk down from the Scott's, you'll see random fertilizer. And on random fertilizer, it'll still have those numbers. 15, 15, 15. It's the same exact stuff. Still has 15% nitrogen, 15% phosphorus, 15% potassium. But they'll sell it to you at like a quarter of the price. Scott's gets all of their money by putting it in a nice, pretty bag. Putting a picture of a nice green lawn on it. But fertilizer is fertilizer, so don't get caught up in it. But, yeah, nobody works for Scott's in here, do they? So, fertilizer is fertilizer for the most part. I mean, most of the fertilizers that come in are relatively high in nitrogen when you're talking about turf or wheat. They love nitrogen. And so most all of them are really heavy in the nitrogen load. But there's also the wrong time, so let's give this one. And I always say this more as a joke, but I think people have taken me seriously in the past, is that one time we decided there was our next door neighbor, he was all about having this beautiful green lawn. And so right before the first snow came, when I was living in the Midwest, we went out and we put a really high dose of nitrogen on. And what happened was all of this nitrogen hit the grass, and the grass couldn't use it, but the funguses could. And so the snow came, and it came on top of it. And what happens is you get what's called a pink snow mold. And as the snow melted away, he had a beautiful "I love you" drawn into his lawn in pink. He never could figure out how it happened, and I have no idea what happened. But that's a great example of using nitrogen at completely the wrong time. You got to make sure that the plant can actually utilize it. Yeah, don't piss off a plant guy, because we do know how to mess with you.
I wrote that down. I have another option for our prank wars.
All right. So fertilizer is great. but it's not the end-all, be-all. In fact, if you can go without it, it's definitely the best way to do it. There are natural ways to add it, so you guys that want to do your lawn in the fall, put on chicken manure. It'll stink really bad for a while, but in the spring, it will be available to the plant and does a great job. A little bit better for the environment if you're worried about that.
But isn't it also true that mulching your lawn
Yes.
puts the grass back in and that's nitrogen?
Yes, exactly. That's the other nice thing. If you mulch it. Yeah, because anything that's green has it, right? Has nitrogen, has a bunch of other things too. You got to cut it up fine enough because otherwise you build up your thatch layer and then you get grubs. But all right. So the other way that we can add nitrogen to a wheat field now is the use of crop rotation. And the two plants that I want to talk about really quickly, the first one is Persian clover and the second one is alfalfa. Both of these plants are wonderful in that both of them are found naturally in Afghanistan, and both of them have an amazing ability. And that ability is the fact that both of these plants have the ability of producing nitrogen that other plants can use. Okay? And so if we can introduce both of these plants into our production system, we can increase the total amount of nutrients for the wheat without adding fertilizer. So let me explain for a second. Those two plants are called legumes. And those two legumes really can be in a perfect partnership with our wheat. Okay? It's the pitcher and the catcher theory, right? One gives, the other one takes. All right? So in this case, the giver of the system is the clover and the alfalfa, or lucerne. Both of these plants, when they are growing, will provide nitrogen to the soil. Wheat, on the other hand, and same with corn and rice, all of these are nitrogen takers. In order for them to produce at high levels, they have to have a fairly high dose of nitrogen. If you were to grow wheat in a nitrogen deficient area, the plants tend to be shorter and yellow in color. If, however, you grow wheat in a high nitrogen environment, the plant tends to grow taller and has a darker green color. That's the effect of nitrogen. This plant produces more grain per unit area than this one. Plain and simple. What happens is that the clover and the alfalfa have the ability of accumulating nitrogen in their roots. You can see it down here. You see these roots here. You see these balls right here. We call them nodules. Those nodules are just chock full of nitrogen. And the wonderful thing about those nodules, the nitrogen, is that if a wheat plant is growing next to it and these nodules begin to break down, they release nitrogen into the soil that is immediately available for my wheat plant to take it up. And when it does, it grows better. So somehow or another, if I can introduce these plants into my production system, I can increase my total production. But there's a problem. And the problem is that how much do we, or how much do people of Afghanistan, eat clover or alfalfa? Their animals love it, but not them. Are you going to then take a whole field out of production and put in clover or alfalfa? Probably not. So what can you do? Well, Paul and I started playing around with this, and I blame Paul for this because he got me thinking about it. And the idea is what happens if instead of growing just wheat, we interplant alfalfa or clover? Okay, so the idea is I'm going to go through, I'm going to plant my wheat, and then I'm going to plant my clover or my alfalfa. Well, that's a great idea because what happens? The clover and the alfalfa grow up. They produce nitrogen. My wheat plant is sitting next to it. it starts grabbing that available nitrogen and it grows better. All is perfect. But here comes the problem. Sometimes, in some environments, and actually Paul just saw this last year, sometimes the clover or the alfalfa grows better than the wheat. Well, what happens? If the clover or the alfalfa starts growing better than the wheat, the clover outcompetes the wheat. Well, if it outcompetes the wheat, well, the wheat eventually dies. I don't produce grain. Uh-oh. That could be a problem. So we started thinking about it, and we came up with this solution. And the solution, I think, is fairly simple. What happens if we can control our potential losses, right? So yeah, sometimes the wheat will outproduce the alfalfa or the clover, great. But what happens in those off years when the clover outproduces the alfalfa, or the clover and the alfalfa outproduce the wheat? So what can we do? So here's my suggestion. How about this? Let's imagine that this room is my wheat field. I'm going to go through and I'm going to plant my wheat, right? So here I have wheat planted across this entire field. And then I'm going to come in, and right here up against the wall, I'm going to plant a 3-foot strip of clover or alfalfa, the entire length of the field. 15 feet over from that, I'm going to plant another 3-foot strip. 15 feet over, I'm going to plant another 3-foot strip. 15 feet over, another 3-foot strip. Plants are going to grow. If it's one of those off years where the clover outcompetes my wheat, that's okay, because it only kills a 3-foot strip every 15 feet. If, however, it's a year where the wheat outcompetes the clover, great. My whole field has wheat. Okay, well, I come in and I harvest. First, I come through, I harvest those patches that have 0 clover. Take that, thrash it, get the grain, keep the straw. I next come through and I harvest those patches that still have clover in it. Because I got to be careful. One of the things that I realized was if I harvest the wheat and the clover patches, the clover straw might not be as good as the wheat straw. So I'm going to have to be careful about that. So that is one problem. But go through, I harvest that. Then what happens? Well, I come in and I plow the field. Well, if I planted my strips in this direction, I'm going to plow my field in this direction. Because what I'm going to do, I'm going to take those roots that have all of that nitrogen and I'm going to spread it across my whole field. Next year comes. Plant the whole thing in wheat. This time, however, instead of planting my 3-foot strip of clover up against the edge of the field, I'm going to move in 3 feet and plant a 3-foot strip. 15 feet over, 3-foot strip. 15 feet over from that, 3-foot strip. Harvest it, plow it going this way. The following year, move my strip over again another 3 feet. What am I doing? I'm doing micro rotations. Every year, I am rotating in clover or alfalfa. Still have wheat across the entire field. But I'm getting these little tiny strips of rotated material. And in plowing it opposite direction, I'm probably spreading the wealth a little bit. Somebody asked me, is this better? I go, well, depends. Is doing nothing going to fix the problem? So it's kind of how you want to look at it. Agronomically or agriculturally, however you want to look at it, should work. And theoretically, in 5 years, you will have done a complete rotation of your field. And then you can start back going the other way. And I think if you do that, even in small strips, I think anything is better than adding nothing. And the reality is that we're not going to be giving them fertilizer. pretty certain of that, because fertilizer has, you know, two uses. One is for plants, and you all know what the second one is. So I think this is going to be way better than the alternative. All right.
And Jeff, just for your information, on the first day we asked folks what's one thing they'd like to learn, and several folks had asked about, well, alternatives to opium. Now we realize it's a high value crop, but I think why Jeff spent so much time on this and why we gave it thought is that we wanted to try to address several issues facing Afghan farmers. As we know, wheat is their most important crop, but we also know they put very little plant food back into it. So how do we improve the fertility of the land while they continue to grow wheat? But the interesting thing with wheat clover is that there's several value-added things to this. Not only improving the productivity of the soil, but the clover has value. You're going to see tomorrow there's some photos of how they bundle up alfalfa and clover and sell it in the market. When it flowers, if timing is right, you could bring in your beehives, and I think we've heard of clover honey here, hopefully. So that's another value-added product. Plus the seed heads from the clover. If they can harvest clover seed, that's another value-added product. So while I'm not saying that it directly is competitive with poppy, but if you start to add up all of these value-added products, it could be attractive to certain farmers.
So any questions? Yes.
Is a cover crop something you would use for an entire season, or could they, if they harvest their wheat and could they plant something?
Yeah,
before they plant?
One thing that we thought about with the cover crops is that you could theoretically, is at the time of harvest until the time that you're ready to plant again, you could potentially plant something like a clover or an alfalfa. My biggest concern, however, is whether or not you have enough moisture to actually get the plant to grow. The other issue that you have is that how long is it in the ground for? Does it actually give you the benefit? Now, I will say that if you have good moisture, it probably will give you enough of a benefit. And in fact, one thing that we had thought about was that if you're in an irrigated land system, you might push irrigation as it goes into finish. If you were to come in a week after your last irrigation and spread alfalfa, there might be enough to get it germinated, but it'll stay low enough that when you come through and harvest your wheat, when you leave the field, the alfalfa or the clover might continue to grow, and you'll still get a little bit of a benefit.
Because remember, they hand harvest, so there's a good chance they could cut it low enough and it'll generate.
Right. So that is the potential. But yeah, for the most part, the concept of the cover crop is you plant it in the off season, work it into the soil, and then keep going. Cover crops create some problems, but in an environment like this, I think the benefits far outweigh the negatives. Anything else? All right. So, quick wrap up for you. A couple things that I think are key issues that we need to address. One is improving our seed bed. The better our seed bed, the more uniform our seed bed is, the better our chances for good germination. If we have a really poor seed bed, what you'll usually find is areas within your field that don't germinate very well. And in those areas that don't germinate well, you tend to have an increase in weed pressure. And so if I can actually have a uniform seed bed where all of my seeds germinated approximately the same amount of time, I'm in much better shape. Okay. Next thing is seed quality. It's all about choosing the best seed suited to your environment. And so making sure that you grab, the right landrace, or if you need it, the UG99 resistant plant is going to be important. I think it's important to be observant and look for the highest quality seed that you can if you're not going to be buying seed, if you're going to be using seed from yourself. And then, making sure that you can do a simple germination test and find out what is the quality of the seed. And we'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow because I'll tell you what the planting rate is. And so here's the nice thing. If I know what the planting rate is, and I know that my germination percentage is only half of what it should be, what do? Well, I just increase the total number of plants that I plant, right? So if I know what my germination is, I can set to make sure that the plants that are put in the ground are going to germinate. Okay? And I use up all available space to increase my total productivity. I want to make sure that I store seed in the proper environment. Here we talked about temperature, humidity. I think the other thing that I should probably add to this is the fact that you need to have airflow. I think that's really critical. Stagnant air tends to increase humidity, and humidity is a real big problem. All right. Last but not least, soil fertility is important. So crop rotation improves soil fertility, and if we can use legumes, and here we're talking about things like alfalfa and clover, we can push the nitrogen levels up, and increase nitrogen increases productivity of wheat. All right. So key points, again, you guys can read those. There are a couple reach back resources that I want to talk about. Most of them you can see in your book. The one that I want to talk about, however, is this one right here. It is the CIMMYT Wheat Doctor. This is probably the coolest wheat site that I can find. So CIMMYT is that international maize and wheat research group based out of Mexico City, Mexico. And they put together this site called the Wheat Doctor. And here's the cool thing about Wheat Doctor is that it is totally visual. You can go to the CIMMYT Wheat Doctor and you basically can scroll through pictures and you can find something. So all of a sudden if you come across, you say, hey, you know what, I saw a plant like that. It looked just like that one. You can click on it and it'll take you to another thing. And it goes, well, that could be caused by this, or this. And you can go, oh, well, I think it was caused by number 2. Well, you click on that one and it'll say, okay, this is a possible solution to that problem. And so it does the best that it can for somebody not being there to look at it, to at least allow for you to diagnose the problem. There's no guarantee that it's great. It's kind of like using WebMD to figure out what your ailments are. You know, I wouldn't necessarily always trust it, but hey, it gives you a good point to jump off from, right? CIMMYT also has what's called the Maize Doctor. Maize Doctor is for corn. So if you happen to be in a region that's also growing corn, you can use CIMMYT Maize Doc to do exactly the same thing. So just a couple of opportunities for you to kind of learn a little bit more about wheat. And I think with that, I'm done.
I have a quick question.
Yes?
Millet, is it close to wheat at all, or is it like
Millet?
Yeah.
It's a small grain, uses exactly the same kind of thing. It's more of a sorghum. Yeah.
Drought tolerant.
It's very drought tolerant.
That's why you see a lot of it in the
Yeah.
But does it take the nitrogen out of the soil?
Yeah. It's still a grass. Almost all the grasses are going to be really heavy nitrogen, heavy plants. The nice thing about millets and sorghums and the sedans is the fact that they don't need as much water. Corn needs a ton of water. Wheat doesn't need a lot, which is kind of nice about it as well. So.